Alright, hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about the base set, both first and second edition. I'm going to kind of give a brief overview on all the cards, kind of how I think about them, and in the case of the removed cards, why they're kind of shit. And I'm going to try and do this for every single set, and I apologize if I sneeze or cough or sound stuffy. It's because I'm sick. I just got sick today, but I really wanted to make this, so we're going to do. So we're going to use the Dominion client and right-click all the cards for most of these, but, you know, obviously Adventurer is not going to be in the client. So for the Intrigue episode and the base episode, we are definitely going to be on this site just for the defunct cards. Anyway, we're going to talk about the defunct cards first. The ones that, if you have them still and you're using them, well, there's a second edition of the base set in Intrigue, and you'll definitely want to pick those up. So the reason I'm doing this is because a lot of people kind of don't know what to do with cards or don't know how to approach these cards, and I'm going to do something a bit different than like a rating system. Like, for example, a lot of people are all about rating cards and like, oh, this card's like the 13th best. Well, how does that help you? How does that help you in a game? You can queue up all the cards you want and oh, that's 8th best, but it might be really awful in that kingdom. So I kind of want to get people at least thinking about how to approach cards and that sort of deal. So we have Adventurer here, and it costs 6. It's an action, and you can reveal cards from your deck until you reveal 2 treasure cards. Put those treasure cards into your hand and discard the other revealed cards. So this card is awful because A, it draws treasure. Usually in like 99% of kingdoms, you don't want to draw just treasure. You want to draw action cards. And the cost is 6. That's completely absurd. This is like probably the worst card in Dominion before everything got nerfed. Before everything got removed. Like, paying $6 for a mode effect where you'll probably end up drawing your coppers or silvers or whatever is absolutely terrible. I recall only one game before this card got removed where I actually like picked it up and it was actually good, and it was a game that involved it had like Ambassador, and I needed to find 2 golds a turn, so Adventurer found me those golds while I was drowning in junk. But that's like super specific, and I probably wasn't correct. It's from so long ago, and I wasn't a very good player back then. So realistically, this card's pretty much never good. And the cost is just so absurd. This card could cost, I mean, I'm going to be honest, Adventurer could probably cost 4, and it probably wouldn't be all that amazing. Don't quote me on that. I'm sure it would find some utility in some like money decks, but like by and large, Adventurer is a pretty awful card. So like as such, it's really hard for me to think of anything where it's good, without stating the obvious, which is, well, if you want to find treasures, that's when Adventurer is good. When you play it and you find 2 treasures. How often it's good? It's pretty much never good. And its cost is absurd for what it does. I don't really know any strengths. The strength is that it always finds treasures, which is not that good. And then its weaknesses are just innumerable. I mean, you're spending 6 on this. Like you could have bought a gold even. Adventurer, if you didn't trash any cards, is going to more likely than not turn up 2 copper, which is worth less than a gold, although it does cycle slightly. But if you're like playing a money deck, you don't really want to cycle. So like Adventurer even messes up there. So yeah, I think we're done talking about Adventurer. Next we'll talk about Chancellor, another card that got removed. This card is one of the more okay cards. It could have stayed, but it generally made the base set a lot weaker. So it costs 3, it gives you 2 money, and then you may immediately put your deck into your discard pile. So basically think of Scavenger, but worse. That probably doesn't help, actually, because we're supposed to cover all the cards. So Chancellor's strength is that it cycles you faster. So if you wanted to buy let's say it's turn 3, like turn 1, turn 2 you buy Chancellor and silver, and then turn 3 you shuffle your deck, you find your Chancellor and your silver, and you buy a 5 cost. Chancellor allows you to toss your entire deck into your discard, so turn 4 you get a new shuffle with that 5 cost in there. And so it speeds up your deck considerably by at least 1 or 2 turns. It could potentially speed up your deck even more, depending on, if you reshuffled your deck and then your 5 cost was on the bottom, you just saved yourself multiple turns. That's kind of silly to think about, because it could bottom deck anyway. So Chancellor saves you basically 1 or 2 turns, because when you have your second shuffle, before your second shuffle, you have 12 cards. You have your 7 coppers, 3 estates, Chancellor, and silver. You buy your 5, and then you skip. So you have a turn with your 5 junk cards, then you draw 2 junk cards, you shuffle. Yes, you draw your 2 junk cards, then you shuffle and you get 3 new cards, of which it's less likely you'll find your 5 cost, or your Chancellor, or your silver. Chancellor allows you to get a clean shuffle. You'll see 5 new cards. Yes, you're going to see those junk cards again, but you're just going to have higher odds of finding the 5 cost, and you'll find it sooner. That is Chancellor's strength. Chancellor is a fine cycler, and cycling is very good in Dominion. However, Chancellor is terminal, which makes it a lot worse. If Chancellor just had +1 action attached to this 2 cost, Chancellor would be a lot better than it currently is. But as it stands, a lot of the 5 costs that you want, and in fact maybe other cards you want to pair with Chancellor, or you would if Chancellor was not terminal, you find it a lot harder to justify it because Chancellor is terminal. Like, you couldn't open Steward Chancellor, for example, or Chapel Chancellor, which otherwise would be an incredible strategy. Opening Chancellor Chapel would be insane. So that's its main weakness, is that it's terminal. So if your 5 costs are not terminal, Chancellor looks a lot better. And even then, its utility is only going to be good for so long, because eventually you're going to want to play other terminals over the ability to cycle slightly faster. And you don't have to think about this anyway, because Chancellor is now a dead card, but you can think about this card, or this concept, with, say, Messenger and Scavenger. The effect does live on in some cards. But yeah, that's basically its gist. Opening utility, it can be useful. It's a silver variant, albeit it's terminal, so it's not that amazing. It's really a rather weak card, but it certainly gives you higher winning percentages if you know when to buy it. But it's, I almost don't think it deserved to be removed, but it's not like I'm heartbroken over it, because it really wasn't that amazing of a card to begin with. Next we'll talk about Feast here. Feast, I also don't think really deserved to be removed at all. Sure, it's a weakish effect, but there are plenty of games where I don't really want a silver. So Feast costs 4. You trash this card, you gain a card costing up to 5. Let's ignore for a moment that you can, say, Throne Room Feast and get 2 actions, which is insane. Or cost reduction, in which you can gain, things like... Anyway, there's some cute things you can do with Feast. But, alright, so the main strength of Feast is... Basically, this card says... it turns into a 5 when you play it. And the nice thing about this is, well, let's say you want to buy a 5. You could buy 2 silvers, or you could just buy Feast Silver, or something of the sort, and then, well, hey, you get your 5. And it removes itself from the deck. Silvers do not remove themselves from the deck when you get your 5. Feast just does its job of hitting 5, which is the main reason you get silver, and then it removes itself very nicely from your deck, and you're happy. Ignoring also that this card's pretty cool, like Necromancer and Lurker. Like, I feel like this card got a lot better now that we've had more and more cards introduced that belong in the trash. So I feel like this card really shouldn't have been removed from the base set, but you know, that's just how it is. Its weaknesses, of course, is that, well, it doesn't have too many weaknesses. I mean, obviously it's terminal, but it's a one-shot. You just play it once and you're done. So there's that. There are kingdoms, of course, where you would prefer to have silver over feast because you do want the silver economy, and that's its weakest case, I think. Also, pairing this with another terminal, like, for example, you can't pair this with, like, Chapel. I mean, you could. It probably would be fine, but they could collide. Yeah, I think this is actually better than silver paired with Chapel. Bad example, but you know, like, you have your terminal problem there, potentially. And, yeah, there's not too much more to talk about with this card. It's just, the main thing to think about with Feast is whether or not you really want the silvers, because you do want silver to hit 5, or you do want X card or Y card to hit 5, and then after that it's a lot less important. And Feast just kind of skips all of that and makes your deck potentially thinner for it, slightly thinner. So it's like a percentage play card. It's not, you know, those percentages certainly do matter, I think. Like, once you play your Feast, and I don't know, we already talked about it, so. Next removed card is Spy. Spy is a perfectly fine card. It's actually rather weak for its cost. It could honestly cost 3. It could cost 2. It's really awful. But mostly Spy was removed because it just took forever to resolve. Like, you play your Spy, and then each other player each player reveals the top card of their deck and then discards it or puts it back. Like, that just takes forever. Like, it really slowed down the game, and it wasn't really meaningful, which is why Spy was removed. It's mainly for quality of life. Like, Spy was pretty irrelevant, and then when you play a Spy, you're doing all this revealing for pretty irrelevant reasons. That being said, Spy's nice with, say, like, Vassal. Like, it would have played nice with Vassal, actually. So, like, but yeah, otherwise, there's just really not much to say about this card. Opening Spy Chapel is a thing you could do back in the day. Maybe potentially skip your opponent's Chapel, but it's a very low percent play. Like, you got 12 cards to find. You could maybe find the card they open, or, you know, Chapel. It's 2 out of 12, which is 1 in 6. It's not very great odds, but it is certainly something. And by opening Spy as player 1, you're kind of assuming your opponent doesn't top deck Chapel. And if they top deck Chapel, they're probably just going to win anyway. So, like, it's kind of just a losing play to do in general. Like, I don't know. Like, there's really not much to say about Spy, and we're going to run into this for a couple of the cards like Smithy and Village and such. Like, so I'm going to talk more about basic concepts. Thief also got removed. Thief costs 4. Each other player reveals the top 2 cards of his deck. If they revealed any treasure cards, they trash one of them that you choose. And you may gain any or all of these trashed cards, and may discard the other revealed cards. So, Thief is a horrible card, one of the worst Dominion cards, in that it trashes your opponent's coppers for them, and they're very happy about that, in fact. Donald X has tried on multiple occasions to fix Thief, the Thief concept, and has mostly failed. You have Noble Brigand, you have other cards. He's finally settled on Bandit, which is also quite awful, but it trashes all treasures besides copper, which, you know, it's weak, but you'll get it. Anyway, so Thief, hold on. So Thief is a pretty horrible open. It's not very good. What it's good at is stealing treasures. So if your opponent has a deck where they rely on treasure payload and they've trashed all their coppers and say they need golds or heaven forbid platinums or fool's golds, Thief is absolutely destructive. It will take the fool's gold away from the opponent and you get it. So it can be quite destructive in those instances, and there are cases where Thief is like one of the more powerful cards on the board for that reason, where you can just take your opponent's stuff and then you just kind of play this like horrific demented lottery of who can hit the most treasures. And like it's horrible. But yeah, overall Thief is quite weak. People will open it and then there's like that player, oh, you trashed my copper, and then they cry, and then experienced players are happy. And it's just like no one's happy in the end. Like experience, like once you've gained experience, Thief is awful, and then before you gained experience, Thief is awful, but for different reasons. That's pretty much why it was removed. Like weaknesses, hold on. Oh man, I really shouldn't be doing this while sick. I'm gonna be sneezing quite a bit. Anyway, so yeah, Thief is just overall pretty awful, except for a very few specific cases. Yeah, opening it like I'm not seeing you ever open Thief. I think we've pretty much exhausted Thief there. Woodcutter is another fine card that really didn't need to be removed, but it's pretty boring. So, yeah. It's better than Silver, but also worse than Silver. Sometimes you'll just get Woodcutter because it's the only buy on the board. And if you don't really have any terminal issues, you'll just buy a Woodcutter over Silver, at least for one of them. But usually that's not the case, so it's rather on the weakish side, but sometimes this has to be your terminal because it's plus buy. There's not really much to say other than on boards where there's just one plus buy, you'll buy even the worst card just to have the buy because you need it in order to scale your deck up. But yeah, between the offensive art that's just horrifically awful, to how they cut the wood, to it's so bad, to even just, it's pretty like offensive in its inoffensiveness. It's too basic, it's too simple. Like no one's gonna miss this card. There's really not much to say about it. So I think that's it, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 6 removed cards. So now we can talk about the real cards, the cards that now exist. And I think we're gonna start with Chapel. Like I'm skipping around a bit here, but we'll start with Chapel because it is perhaps the single strongest card in the base set, and if you have no idea why it's strong, I'm about to tell you. So Chapel is it costs 2, and you can trash up to 4 cards from your hand. So the reason Chapel's amazing is because it can trash all of your coppers and your estates. So you start with 7 coppers and 3 estates. Those cards really don't do that much for you. Coppers are okay in the earliest of game, but they get quite worse as the game goes along. And it stops you from playing stuff like, it stops you from playing a bunch of cards. So, cards that actually do things. So it's a lot harder to do that without trashing your cards, and Chapel is one of the most wickedly fast trashers there are, other than like say Donate and Bonfire and all that. Ignoring all that, and even not ignoring those cards, Chapel is just by far one of the strongest trashers in the game. And you can always open it, even on a 2-5, on a 3-4. You can open it no matter what. So it's just quite insane, and you'll often just open it. There are times where you don't get Chapel, but those times are very rare, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So what you do with Chapel is You'll buy your chapel, you maybe pair it with a silver or whatever. Let's just say you pair it with a silver. And you draw 4 coppers in a chapel on your turn 3. Do you trash all 4 coppers? Yes, you do trash all 4 coppers. You're sad about it, you'd prefer to trash estates, but you still trash 4 coppers. And then as you trash down, you kind of need to start thinking about what you want your deck to output per turn. So you have to start thinking about how much copper you need. You need to think about how much economy's in your deck. So, for example, you could have a hand later, after you've trashed those 4 coppers, you draw right, I don't know, you'll buy another silver on your next turn. Yeah, you'll bottom deck your, you'll bottom deck 2 estates. We'll say you get lucky. No, you'll bottom deck a copper in an estate, and you draw 2 estates, 2 estates, silver, and 2 copper. Let's just say you do that, and you buy a silver. Then you shuffle your deck, you draw estate, copper, chapel, silver, and copper, let's say. So you have your hand of 2 coppers, 1 is 2 estates, 2 copper. I'm sorry. I'm not very good at visualization. So you got your chapel, you got your silver, you got your 2 estates, and you got your copper. So, are you going to trash that copper? Well, you have to think about what your deck wants to do. You've trashed 4 coppers already, so you only have 3 coppers left. And you have 2 silvers in your deck. And if you trash that copper, you're not going to be able to buy another silver. So you have to make a judgment call on whether you want that 3rd silver or whether you'd rather trash a card. And really, you're going to have to make that distinction based on whether or not things are or are not on the kingdom. So it's hard to talk about, but generally the thing with chapel that makes the best people excel is planning. Like, I guess I can demonstrate this. We'll demonstrate it. We'll create a table, we'll add a bot, we'll select a kingdom card, we'll select chapel, and we'll kind of just talk about it briefly. I guess I can do that. I guess I'm allowed to do that. So, here, I don't know if I necessarily would open chapel over mask, but we'll just do it for the sake of argument. We'll open, say, chapel and silver. Turn 3. So, in these 7 cards, we have 5 coppers and 2 estates. That's 7 junk cards we don't want. So, we can make a judgment call here. We can trash these 2, or we can trash 3. I think we trash 3 here, and we can buy a settlers. You generally don't need more than 1 chapel, so you don't want to buy a 2nd chapel unless there's advance on the board, in which case you can always advance one of the chapels, and you can potentially trash down even faster. It's stuff to think about. So here we hit 4. Let's just say we buy a silver again, even though it's awful. Here, in our next 6 cards, we have 2 silvers, 1 estate, and I can only presume 3 copper? Has to be 3, right? I think it's 3 copper. So I'm comfortable trashing everything here. Yes. The last card there is a copper. No, it's a settlers. It's a settlers. So, like, I haven't played Dominion in a while. Let's say we buy a gold. So, we'll do this. Hey, we hit 8. Do we want to buy province now? Probably not. I think we're happy doing this. Buying a bank. We'll do this. Do we want to hit 6? Probably. I think hitting 6 is more important than thinning that last copper. We can always thin the copper later. Anyway, you get the gist. You want to track your deck and kind of figure out what you want to do, which can be quite difficult, especially if you're newer at the game, but it's kind of what you need to think about. Familiar cards, here we are. It is what you need to think about, and Chapel is one of the absolute best ways to do it. Chapel just lets you experiment with quick deck building a lot of the time. Also, pro tip, don't bottom deck your Chapel. That's a great way to fall massively behind. So you already have a built-in John. My chapel bottom decked. You have a built-in John right there. So I kind of want to pinpoint certain cards before we talk about more complex cards like Artisan or Festival. Festival is... it's not very complex. It's actually quite simple. But I want to talk about other cards. So now we've got Smithy. Smithy is one of the stronger draw cards in the game, just simply because of its cost and its value of what you get for its cost. I'm not saying it's an amazing card, but, you know, like early on, a Smithy is nice. So Smithy draws you 3 cards. So you start your hand with 5 cards, and drawing cards typically is good, because it means you draw more of your good stuff, or you get closer to drawing your good stuff that you want to draw. So Smithy is quite nice for that. You can open Smithy Silver. It helps you cycle as well. It's kind of a dual role. Early on, drawing helps you cycle, and then later on, drawing helps you find good stuff. I mean, it always helps you find good stuff. So it's a pretty good card. It's a staple card about Dominion. Like if you're, it's pretty simple. There's not really that much to say other than draw is really good, and whenever you can, you want to pick up draw. Its single biggest drawback is that it's terminal, so you'll want to pair it with a village or a card that gives you actions. It's typically what you want to do. There's really not that much to say about Smithy other than it is quite good. But it is a staple in Dominion, for sure. Next up, we're going to talk about Village, another staple. This art should be burned in your mind if you have any experience at all with Dominion, and if not, it will be burned in your mind thereafter. Village is a terrible opener. You almost never want to open Village. There's a couple of exceptions, like Fishing Village, which is basically a silver. You play it. It doesn't draw you a card, it gives you a coin, and the next turn it gives you another coin, so it's basically a silver in value, and it can help you spike price points and such, so that's an exception, but generally you don't want to open villages. Especially this card, you don't really want to open this village. It does nothing on play. You play it, okay, you get 2 actions, but what are those 2 actions doing for you? You've just wasted them. Like, they're not doing anything for you. So the value isn't there. The value in Village comes when you have 2 terminal cards. Like, say we have 2 Smithies, or a Smithy and a Chapel. Well, we play our Village, then we can play a Smithy, and we draw a bunch of cards, and then we can select which 4 cards we want to trash with Chapel, as an example. It's a terrible example, because realistically that's never going to happen, but that specific setup where you open Village, Chapel, like, that's terrible. Don't do that. Don't do that. It's not good. There might be a case where it's good, like if there's alms on the board, but like we're not going to talk about that. It's not important. By and large, you don't want to open Village, so don't open Village unless you have a very good reason to. Simply because you could have bought a silver, and then that could have bought a 5 cost, and then you'd want a Village afterwards, and it's just the wrong order, basically. But Village is a very strong card, and typically there's not too much to talk about with villages as singular cards. Like, the exceptions are like Fishing Village and Villa and Border Village. Typically a village is a village, and you just want a village because you want to play more terminals. That's basically it. So you get to play more Smithies, you get to play more Chapels, although why you'd play more than 1 Chapel is beyond me. We're just talking about the terminals we do know about. So, yeah, Village is quite nice. You'll pick them up later, but don't open it. And try and maintain a balance of terminals and villages. Typically this isn't a hard rule, but typically your deck fares slightly better on average if you have 1 more village than terminal, at least until you can guarantee drawing your deck. Just because things can happen, you can bottom deck a village and then you're just hosed, and it's just kind of a safety village that you can potentially have. But these are just deck compositional tricks that are not terribly useful. They're very situational. So we've talked about the big 3 pillars of Dominion in terms of trashing, drawing cards, and then villages. Those are the big pillars. I know we kind of talked about the defunct cards first, but that may have thrown you off. But anyway, now we'll talk about the cards in no particular order, I suppose. We'll just go down the list. So Artisan is a card that costs 6, and you get to gain a card to your hand costing up to 5. So it can gain 5 costs, it can gain less than 5, it can go up to 5. And then you put a card from your hand onto your deck. So you can set up your next turn, you can set up stuff for vassals, you can play the card you just gained, assuming you have the actions for it. Artisan is a very flexible card that gets... it's quite strong in the early game. If you can buy it turn 3, you're just going to gain all the 5 costs, top deck them, use the 5 costs to get right back around to your Artisan, and it just snowballs from there. But if you pick up an Artisan later and later in the game, it gets generally weaker, and its terminality really hurts it. But generally, you always want an Artisan. And I say generally, you don't always want an Artisan, but typically you do. So the earlier you can get it, the better. Now, if you don't want to gain a bunch of 5 costs, Artisan significantly decreases in value. But you also have to remember it can gain duchies, which will help you score in the end game, so it can be quite okay. So typically when Artisan's on the board, I look for ways to hit 6 quickly, or at least have the chance of hitting 6. Double silver can hit 6. Ironmonger silver can hit 6. Stuff like that. I look for those things. And, you have to make a value judgment on whether or not hitting Artisan's more important than, say, trashing or doing something else. So you have to keep your other options in mind. But whenever Artisan's on the board, there is that option of, I want to hit 6, I want to gain all these cards, is this good? So you kind of have to keep that in mind. Yeah. And the main reason Artisan's weak, the later you gain it, is you gain less with it. It's just a value. It's a value sort of deal. You get less value out of your Artisan per cards you gain, but you probably still have to pick it up even if you get it a bit later. Next, we'll talk about Bandit. Bandit is the quote-unquote fixed thief, which in a lot of ways is marginally better than Thief, but I find myself often wishing Bandit was just Thief, which is kind of funny, because I really want to trash my opponent's platinums, and I cry when I can't. Well, I mean gain the platinums. It can trash platinum. It can trash Fool's Gold. It can do all of that. I'm thinking of Noble Brigand. But Bandit can't gain you those cards. You just gain a gold, and it costs 5, which is rather pricey. So Bandit junks you a gold, which is funny because a lot of new players like gold, but gold's kind of bad. Yeah, gold isn't like horrible, but it's not that good. Typically gold can get in the way of doing things you really want to do, especially if you're using your terminal space to play Bandit to gain a gold. I think that's the more egregious sin. Like, once you thin down and you have your deck rolling, sure, you'll take a Bandit, sure, you'll take golds. Why not? But before then, Bandit's kind of bad because it's not helping you improve your deck significantly enough. Like, yes, adding a gold to your deck does improve your deck economy and your average per turn for money, but if you're not drawing your deck, basically drawing your deck or playing a bunch of action cards is going to increase value a lot more than adding gold to your deck until you can get your deck under control, and then Bandit starts looking a lot nicer. So you want to time your Bandit purchases, assuming you want the golds in the first place. And of course, we're not talking about the cases in which money strategies are good. Like, where you just look at the board and you think, well, there's no way an engine's going to get it together in time or at all, and then you want golds for sure. But yeah, Bandit's kind of a weaker card, and that's kind of my approach when I'm thinking about Bandit is, well, do I want the gold payload, or do I want to start hitting my opponent's platinums potentially? And if I want to hit my opponent's platinums, he'll probably want to hit my platinums, which means he also wants a Bandit, which means we're going to have a bunch of gold condoms to protect us potentially. against platinum hits, which is pretty funny. So you got to keep that in mind. So sometimes, again, it's just a degenerate lottery where someone hits cards more than the other person, and then you just cry. But sometimes Dominion be like that, I guess. But yeah, this perspective's awful. It's so bad, I don't want to look at it anymore. Next we have Bureaucrat, one of the worst cards in Dominion. It's really bad, and even when I sometimes pick it up thinking it's good, it's just not. So, like, if you never buy Bureaucrat, like, you're not going to lose very many games for it. It's pretty rare when you do want a Bureaucrat, but sometimes you do. There's been kind of a renaissance in Dominion thinking recently, where probably in the last 1 or 2, 3 years, where there's been kind of a conventional wisdom broken where you don't want silvers, but like gaining silver is pretty nice. Like, let me give you an example. We're gonna skip way ahead to Renaissance, right? We're gonna look at Sculptor. Sculptor can gain silvers to hand. That's very good. It's not the single best thing about Sculptor, but it can gain silvers to hand, and in many money decks, you just want Sculptor pretty hard. In fact, most decks you just want Sculptor. Sculptor is an incredible card, and I cannot stress this enough. Bureaucrat's just like a shitty version of Sculptor, where instead of putting the silver into your hand and giving you a villager, it top decks the silver. And yeah, that's a lot worse. That's a lot worse than Sculptor. But hey, it attacks your opponent, but then you attack yourself by top decking the silver. So like, what's the point? It's really not that good. What the card does is actively harmful towards you getting your deck under control a lot of the time. Bureaucrat's best case use is when you want to scale economy without buying it, in which case buying a Bureaucrat as a shitty workshop is better than not doing it. But that requires you drawing your deck or most of it, or just wanting to flood your deck with silver, but you still play a bunch of cards a turn, because Bureaucrat doesn't do anything when you play it. If it put the silver into a hand, that'd be one thing, but it doesn't. It top decks the silver. So if you have a hand of 3 silvers, a Bureaucrat, and an estate, which is actually quite likely, you can't play your Bureaucrat and buy province. You can only buy gold. So Bureaucrat's really bad at hitting 8. So you want to make damn sure that when you're picking up your Bureaucrat, you have the ability to hit 8, and that can absolutely kill you a lot of the time. Because Bureaucrat does nothing on play. It just top decks the silver. And also the victory card attack is mostly insignificant. It can hurt, but it's not a reason to pick up Bureaucrat. It's just a nice little bonus, and it's certainly not a reason to pick up Bureaucrat when you otherwise wouldn't. So Bureaucrat's a terrible card, especially if you open it. Like, you just don't want to open Bureaucrat ever, pretty much. So your best case for Bureaucrat is when it's a shitty workshop, and that just gains silvers. That's really, this card should have been removed over, say, Feast. Like, this card is worse than Feast, in my opinion, by a lot. Next, we're going to talk about Cellar. Cellar is an interesting card because it's not terribly good, but it makes decks more consistent just by adding it. If you have a kind of a wobbly deck that like otherwise can do good stuff, you can toss in 1 or 2 Cellars just to up the chance of drawing your deck. It's not a card you open with, it's just a support card that can be absolutely crucial, and it can make your turns go from a dud to not a dud, which is just infinitesimal value. It's really good, but Cellar itself is not all that good. It's just something you toss in your deck when you want to increase your odds of not dudding. And you don't want too many Cellars. I would say 2 is already stretching it. Maybe you want 2. It shines best in decks where you can't really trash very quickly, or you can't really trash at all. You have all your 3 estates and your 7 coppers. But it's a very powerful deck, and if you can find all your pieces, you can draw a lot of your deck. Cellar helps you find those pieces. Of course, your seller can bottom deck, but that's just the Dominion life. That's just how it goes. There's not too much more to talk about with this card. It's more of a consistency card. It's a card you pick up when you want to up your consistency, which may or may not be valuable. And it certainly is like a percentage play. It's not gonna like win you too many games, but it can save you from losing some games that you otherwise would have won. So like that's not insignificant, and every turn counts, and seller can maybe save your turn. So it's something to think about, definitely, for your deck, especially if you can guarantee top decking a seller or something of the sort. It's very nice. It's very hard to guarantee that. I don't know. Like, why would you Prince a seller? I don't know. But yeah, it can save your turns, potentially. Council Room is a card that's very hard to talk about because it's very hard to talk about the downside of Council Room. By itself, +4 cards and +1 buy for $5 is immense value, and there's a reason there's this downside here, that each other player draws a card because of what you play. So, let me paint you an example where you play your Council Room. It's the last turn of the game, so your opponent draws a card, but it doesn't matter because you end the game and you win. So, you just got value out of Council Room that your opponent didn't get to maximize on. On the other hand, you could play a Council Room, your opponent would have had 7, but he drew a gold and now he hits 8. So, because you play this one Council Room, your opponent now hits Province, whereas he wouldn't have before. So that's the risk with Council Room. That's the tremendous scariness of Council Room. It can be as swingy as one side and as swingy as the other. Council Room is a great draw card, but you don't want to add too many of them, because the more Council Rooms you add, the more consistent you make your opponent, and you might not want that. You might not want your opponent to be more consistent. That can be quite scary. Of course, if their consistency is already through the roof, it's not going to matter whether or not you play a Council Room. They're still going to draw their deck. But as they add green cards to their deck, and even with super consistent decks, you can draw free cans where you don't find a village. It can happen. But give someone like a 6 or 7 card hand and you might have just saved their turn from that freak dud, which happens more than you would think. So, Council Room is quite hard to talk about because of that. So you kind of have to measure in your head. All right, I've got 2 Council Rooms. Am I going to use the third buy? And if not, then why play the second Council Room? Because it's just boosting my opponent. But if you've played like 8 Council Rooms already, you might as well play the other one, because why not? They're going to draw their deck anyway. You might as well have the extra buy. Like, what's the point? So, you kind of have to keep all that in mind. This is a very interactive part of the card. I think it's quite nice. You can do tricks with it too, where you can you can rig somebody's shuffle. Like, if they have a good turn and they're 1 card away from triggering their shuffle, which their draw pile's empty, and they have good cards in their hand because you're tracking their deck, you can play the Council Room versus not playing it. This isn't as relevant with, say, buying a Lost City, which has the same effect when you buy it. It draws everybody a card. You can definitely rig turns with that, and it's something to keep in mind. But yeah, Council Room, the effect is very powerful, and if you can mitigate this effect of each other player drawing a card, like for example, if you can militia them right afterwards, Council Room is just absolute murder. It will, like, you can play all the Council Rooms you want, and then you play a militia, and then they cry as they toss their hand at 3 cards. So anytime you can prevent somebody from drawing cards, or shrink their hand size, it's absolute murder. Especially as if you play a bunch of Council Rooms, you draw your opponent more than 3 good cards, and they have to toss at least a couple of those consistency cards that help them draw their deck as they're going down. So you might even prevent them from drawing their deck, which is depraved because you drew them a bunch of cards. So Council Room certainly can have its strengths, and it's certainly a card that I usually want at least one of a lot of the time, just because it just the sheer amount of cards it draws and then the plus buy. Of course, there is the downside, so you have to keep that in consideration. I don't really have any specific advice other than just be really aware. Don't be afraid to play a Council Room, but just be careful. Festival is a weaker village. It doesn't really draw you any cards. It's just +2 actions, +1 buy, +2 coins. It doesn't draw a card, which is a significant downside. It happens more often than not when you play a village and you're just hoping, and then you draw a card and you're just happy. So Festival gives you... It doesn't replace itself when you play it, and that can be quite sad. So Festival is a sadder village. That doesn't help you draw your deck as much as, say, a village. And it's, as such, I don't know that it's always worth the buy and the 2 coins you get, especially considering its cost. But sometimes it's the only village, and then you just need it. And you'll buy festivals, too, alongside your normal villages, just because it gives buy and it gives coin, and you're getting more value out of it at that point. But it certainly can backfire, and it's one of the weaker villages for sure. But it's by no means a terrible card. It's just, you have to keep that in mind, that it's not going to help you draw your deck as much as it could. Gardens is a noob trap card. Everyone loves Gardens and wants it to work. And everyone used to think it always worked. There's always someone wanting to make a Gardens rush work, and just often it's just strictly worse than whatever you would do. There are some Gardens rushes you can do. There's Beggar Gardens, which Beggar, when you play it, gives you 3 coppers and puts them into hand. That's certainly a thing, but it's not a very strong thing. If you're terrible at building engines, it's going to destroy any engine that person can build, but if you are a top player, you're just going to get smashed by that player a lot of the time, because they're just going to deny Gardens. And depending on the board, they might even get trash for benefit value out of it. Yeah, so the engine player can always buy Gardens to deny you points. And yeah, it slows them down a bit, but it slows you down a lot more, because it means your ramp-ups are just less extreme every time you hit 10 cards. And the thing with Gardens is, like, if you don't have any gains, it takes you 10 turns just to ramp up Gardens by 1. That's horrible. So typically, for Gardens to work, you need a lot of gainers. Or cards that can gain a lot. Like Workshop Gardens is the classic example of a Gardens deck. Let me show you a Workshop. So gain a card costing up to 4, so you can gain potentially 2 cards a turn if you find your Workshop and you buy a copper or a silver or Gardens or whatever you want to do. And that's assuming your Workshops don't collide, in which case you're gaining even less cards a turn. But yeah, Workshop Gardens is absolutely horrific. People still will play it in the lower bound of players. It's not a good strategy. Please stop doing it. There's usually something just strictly better on the board than that. I will note that there's a bit of theory crafting where Witch can interact with Gardens, where you give them a bunch of curses, but then you just boost their Gardens. So you're at a certain point, you're just helping them. You're just helping the Garden strategy more than you're hurting them. But, so that's something to keep in mind. But, yeah, realistically, Gardens is a card I think very lowly of. I don't think it's very good. There does come a point in a lot of decks, depending on what you're playing, where Gardens is the same as Duchy, and at that point you might as well buy Gardens over Duchy, because what if you hit 40 cards? Well, then you're not up a creek. It's cheaper than Duchy, and it's just strictly better. So that's something to keep up in mind as well. Um, if you're like at 25 cards and you expect the game to go along longer, but you want to buy a Duchy, you might as well buy a Gardens as well, because there is that potential upside, and it just gives you more options, and it's going to be the same as Duchy and potentially better. So, but yeah, like Gardens strategies in and of themselves are usually awful, and they're not always awful, but they're usually very awful. And usually Gardens is more of a supplemental strategy than anything else. But again, playing against this is very situational. You kind of have to have an idea of where things are going. I've certainly messed up decks that should easily beat Gardens against Gardens. Like, the timing is a little hard sometimes. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's certainly doable, and you should be able to do it with practice. So if you're getting continually smashed by Gardens strategies, where they're just going for, like, workshop Gardens, it's usually quite possible to beat those strategies, so just keep that in mind. But yeah, Gardens is a very bad card, I think. Harbinger is also a very bad card in that it doesn't do very much to actively hurting your deck. Well, it's not actively hurting your deck, but buying a Harbinger over, say, another card, I would say is actively hurting your deck because you just slowed your deck down for no reason. So, Harbinger draws you a card in an action, and you can look through your discard pile. You may put a card from it on top of your deck. So, Harbinger's a cantrip that allows you to potentially top deck a card. So, if you want to play multiple goons in a shuffle, and you can buy Harbingers because they're relatively cheap. They're nice for goons to buy for VP. They're relatively harmless. You can play a Harbinger and set up goons for multiple turns so that you're playing your goons more often. That's a bigger example that is rare, but it happens. And I say it's rare because, well, it's not that rare. It's like maybe a 40% play, where you can open Harbinger with your Traveler, and then you can play your Traveler. Next turn, oh, here's my Harbinger. You can use it to top deck your Traveler, and if you're even luckier, you can draw it immediately. So it could speed up your Traveler line by like a solid 2 or 3 turns if you're really lucky. So it can do that for you, and then it's also a nice target for tokens. So Harbinger is really nice in those cases in which you want to top deck a card that you want to play over and over and over, but there's no way you're drawing your deck. So Harbinger is just nice for letting you play a card over and over again, potentially. You have to draw correctly, but it does give you the opportunity to do that. Outside of that, Harbinger does nothing when you play it. If you're drawing your deck every single turn, Harbinger doesn't really help you at all. It just doesn't. It doesn't help you. It doesn't do anything. You don't have a discard pile. You just play it and you draw a card. And okay, well, you might, it's almost as if it's not even there. So Harbinger has like the floor of literally a cantrip that you just spent 3 on, which, by the way, you'll still sometimes do over silver because it's better than nothing, and in that it's nothing or slightly better than nothing, and then silver is actively hurting you. I'm sorry. Bless me. You'll buy it over nothing, surely, because it has the potentiality of being better than nothing, but it's realistically not going to be better than nothing. So it's not a very good card, but it's not offensive. I think the most offensive thing about it is if you're buying this card when there's discard attacks floating around, because you'll have it in hand and then you don't know what you'll draw with your Harbinger if you toss not your Harbinger. Yeah, you could draw a gold. You could also draw an estate. You could also draw a copper that you would have tossed if you had not played that Harbinger. You would have drawn that card that Harbinger would have drawn. You lost information. You potentially made a callous error. So you want to be careful buying Harbinger with discard attacks. Again, the example being goons. Yes, you want to play your goons and use your Harbinger to top deck the goons, but if you're already drawing your deck, you don't really need Harbinger's help to do that. terribly much. At least you don't want more than 1 or 2 Harbingers, usually. And it can actively hurt your deck to have Harbingers. So it's like a double-edged sword, at least in the case of goons. So it's something to be aware of and be careful. I talked a lot about a card that does nothing. It's really funny. Next we have Laboratory, which seems like it's a Dominion staple, right? Like, it costs 5, it gives you +2 at cards and then +1 action. It's a staple, definitely. It's one of the most thematic cards in Dominion. I tend to undervalue this card, but it draws you cards for free. You just play it, and then you draw 2 cards, and then you can do more stuff. I tend to undervalue this card because I'll look at, say, Smithy and Village. Yeah, that draws you more cards, but you have to connect them. Laboratory, you don't have to connect to anything, and then you can draw cards for free, basically. So, Lab is quite good at that. It can get expensive, though, because it does cost 5. I'm sorry. Laboratory can get expensive as a draw card, but you still want to draw cards. So you're willing to pay that price, and it's more expensive, but it's not that more expensive. Surely there are a lot of better draw cards out there. Like, it draws the same amount as Moat. You just don't need to find a village before it, which is very good, but you're paying an extra 3 for it. So in that sense, it can feel expensive, but it's actually quite a solid card. I don't know that I would buy all 10 laboratories in a lot of kingdoms, but I would certainly buy quite a few labs. And I also want to note that I know for a fact I have a losing percent with laboratory specifically. So it could be an aberration. It could be coincidence because, you know, there's so many cards in the game, and you'd expect there'd be a couple false positives, but I kind of sort of suspect that I'm just not that good with laboratory. I do think I underrate it. So it's a good card. I wouldn't call it a great card, but it's a good card. Drawing cards is good. Is basically laboratory, especially if you can draw them for free without having to spend an action. It's quite good. Next up, we're going to talk about Library. Library is a weakish draw card. So, let's say you start with 5 cards and you play your Library. Well, now you have 4 cards, and you can draw 7 cards. So you're drawing 3. You're drawing +3. You can skip any action cards that you find, which means you can play better with Library Money, potentially. Like, let's say you play Library Money and you find a library while drawing cards. Well, A, you're going to cry because that's a library you could have drawn your next turn, but you get to at least skip it and give yourself a better odds of finding treasure. Now, I want to say that Library Money is terrible, but this flexibility of setting aside action cards and potentially rigging your shuffles is very good. So, if you're playing a library and you don't want to trigger your shuffle, but you know how many action cards you have in your draw pile, and you just want to get right to the end of your shuffle, you can skip a bunch of action cards just to ensure you don't trigger that shuffle. Because if you trigger a shuffle when you're playing Library, those cards you set aside are still set aside. They go to your discard after you're done resolving Library, so you're not going to get them into your draw pile. So it can be actively bad to trigger a shuffle with Library if you set aside a lot of actions, so you need to be careful. You need to be very careful with Library in that regard. But it gives you an amount of control over what you're drawing, which is definitely not insignificant. It can be quite significant, so you need to be careful with that. Typically, Library, though, just caps your draw. This is a draw to X variant, in which drawing to X is the amount of cards you can draw to. Library is both terminal and also only draws you up to 7 cards. So if you say play cards like Festival you're getting more value out of your library because you're playing disappearing actions, as these are sometimes called. You might hear that lexicon. Because it shrinks your hand size, but library can draw you right back up. So there are draw to X kingdoms where you can certainly play your festivals and your squires and your this and your that, and then you can draw right back up with library for immense value. Library even gets incredibly strong with cards that let you gain and play. You can play all the way down to 1 card. You can play your library, draw everything back up, including the cards you gained, and you're playing the cards you gained on the same turn. That's insane value. You're not waiting a turn to play those cards. So with like Villa, library is insane. Villa lets you play all your treasures. You buy your Villa, then you put your Villa into your hand. You play the Villa, and then you play library and just draw all these cards. Library is great with Black Market. Black Market puts all your treasures into play, and assuming you have the actions, you can play your library right afterwards and draw a bunch of cards. So there's certainly a lot of synergistic things you can do with library that are just absolutely insane, that let you maximize the amount of cards you draw. And if you get down to 1 card, and you play your library, you just drew 7 cards with 1 action. That's insane value. Like, that's incredibly good. Drawing 7 cards with an action. Drawing 6 cards with an action. 5 cards. 4 cards. For $5, drawing 4 cards is really good. But it will only draw you that much if you don't have very many cards in hand. So you have to, it's a balance. And library is certainly on the weaker side of things because it doesn't draw you more than 7 cards in hand. Whereas things like laboratory and Smithy are uncapped. You can just keep drawing with them forever. 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. And you can have 20 cards. And if you want 20 card decks, and it's realistically feasible to do that, library is just only going to get in the way a lot of the time. So that's kind of what you look for when you see library. Market. Market costs you 5. It's +1 card, +1 action, +1 buy, and then +1 coin. It's a card that doesn't hurt you. It generates a coin, and then it generates a buy. Is essentially what it does. I also tend to undervalue market, and I think that's just because of the buy aspect. I'll just buy it too late, and then by then your opponent who bought it sooner is getting more value out of it because he's buying more cards, in which case, and then it just compounds itself. So as soon as you want to buy, you'll buy a market. Maybe you'll buy a market even a bit earlier versus a bit later, because it does generate economy. It's not like buying just a card with straight plus buy. It's got a coin attached to it that I think a lot of people, including myself, forget about. So you are actually improving your deck, and not just by adding a buy, you're also adding some economy. So it's better to buy a market a turn early than a turn late, I think. If we're going to measure value. Like, if you hit 6 and you're like, well, I really want a gold, maybe you'll buy market over the gold. Over, say, buying the gold and then the market. It's the same deal most of the time. You might as well buy the market the turn earlier, because then it gives you flexibility in what to do with the buy. And then buying the gold can potentially even stop you from hitting 5 on the next turn, which is hilarious because it's gold. Maybe gold's not the best example, but let's say you want to buy an expensive card and then market. Well, that expensive card might prevent you from hitting 5 the next turn, whereas the market doesn't hurt your deck at all. Unless you're drawing terminally and you happen to draw it, which is always a thing you have to worry about. But yeah, like, by and large, market is a pretty good card. It's got, I don't have the stats for it in front of me, but it's certainly, it seems to be undergained, which is kind of funny. That being said, I don't know that I would buy all 10 markets. At a certain point, paying $5 for a peddler with a buy it can be worse than just doing something else. So, like, there is a cap to the value, but I think early on you do want it. It just helps your deck a lot. Market's a good card. I would say it's a good card. I would buy it on my first 5 quite often, or at least second 5. It really depends on what the 5s are or what you want to do. Merchant is the card that everyone calls Grand Market without the buy, which really pisses me off because it's not true in the slightest. It's a good card, but you have to find a silver in order to make it really good. And silver is in itself not a great card. So you'll usually want 2 silvers if you're not drawing your deck, 2 or even 3, heaven forbid, just to maximize your merchants, because you could play 7 merchants. Oh, you didn't find your silver? Well, that's too bad. That's really too bad. So merchant has that element of risk to it. But $3 for a peddler is really, really good. It's actually very good. So the reason this card gets compared to Grand Market, which I think is ridiculously absurd, is you play your merchant, and then you find your silver, and then you get a coin out of it, and then that somehow makes it Grand Market. Because pairing a merchant together with a silver, it's a silly comparison, I think. I'm probably not doing it justice, but you'll see this card be compared to the Grand Market for some reason, because Dan Brooks said something once or something. But yeah, like, this is a card you don't typically want too early, because you buy it too early, and well, you just bought a cantrip a lot of the time. But it is a card you also want a lot of eventually, if you want the silver, and assuming you can find the silver with the merchants, it's actually quite great at making your deck a lot more consistent and generate a lot more money per turn. Because that's what consistency does. That's what peddlers do. They up your amount of money per turn on average, which is insanely good. Sure, they don't add a lot of value to your deck if you're already drawing your deck, but they up your average if there's a decent chance that you don't draw your deck. They just up your average by a lot, because they don't hurt your deck and they just do something good. So, yeah, that's kind of how I approach Merchant. It's an interesting card to say for sure. Next we have Militia, which I hold as one of the best attacks in the game. It's brutal. Not Ghost Ship brutal, but for its cost, it's insanely good. Militia gives you 2 coins, and each other player discards down to 3 cards in hand. And yeah, it's quite often when Militia's on the board, I just gravitate towards opening it, because if I hit an opponent's hand where he would have hit 5, like let's say he had 3 coppers and a silver and an estate. Oops, I played Militia. Well, I guess you don't have 5 anymore, you just have 4. And that just puts somebody way behind. So, like, there's a first-person advantage to Militia inherent in Militia, where if I play Militia turn 3, I just hurt your chances to hit 5, as you being the second player, before you've even really had a chance to, like, react or do anything. And that can absolutely bury someone in the right circumstances. It's not terribly high chances. You could hit 5 in your next turn, or you could hit 5 on turn 5. But you've already shuffled your deck. You didn't put a 5 cost in your hand before shuffling your deck, so you would have had shit luck anyways. And alright, let's say you hit 5 turn 4. Well, I'm just as equally likely to find Militia turn 4, and then I screwed you. So, like, Militia might not do anything early game, but it might, and it's catastrophic when it does. And it maintains its usefulness as you continue to play. It's just more cards you have to draw your deck. You might have to toss a good card, the more good cards you add to your deck. You're not going to have those shitty cards forever in most kingdoms, so, oh well, whoops, I guess you have to toss a village and draw a card and keep 2 draw cards in a village. Like, that's killer. That's a bunch of cards you just didn't draw because of Militia. It's cruel. So it can fuck up a lot of turns. And for $4, it's a silver variant that hurts your opponent potentially every single time you play it. And of course it's terminal, but if you're gonna pair this with like another card, like a silver or something, or a village or a vassal, like it's quite good. It's just the value just the immediate value you get just for its cost is just, it's so good. I cannot sing in this card's praises enough, honestly. Like, it's quite good. There are times where the discard actively hurts you and helps the opponent, but those times are few far in between, and you'll know it because it has like Library or Cursed Village or something like that. But yeah, this card just by itself is just incredibly powerful. Speaking of incredibly powerful, I'm just kidding. This card's not very good. Mine is not very good. In fact, I think people undergain mine because mine is just not that good. So people tend to get scared with mine. So what the thing with mine is it costs 5, which is already incredibly expensive. And with mine, you may trash a treasure from your hand, gain a treasure to your hand, costing up to 3 more than it. Ignoring everything else, like, let's ignore synergies like turning a silver into a gold for you to play encampment with, and then your turn, then you don't lose your encampment. Let's ignore all that. Let's just talk about mine itself. When you play a mine and you turn a copper into a silver, mine is essentially permanently improving your deck as is. So let's say you turn a silver into a gold. That's basically reads, mine gives you +1 money, essentially, when you play it. But it also improves your deck, slightly. It's very slow. That is mine's main weakness, is that it's very slow. What mine is good at, incredibly good at, and this is where the value of mine comes in, is when platinum is on the board, or there's alternate treasures on the board that you really want, that for some reason you didn't immediately buy, like counterfeit. Let's say, like, if you're gonna buy counterfeit, I mean, if you want a counterfeit, you might as well buy it over buying mine and then turning a silver into a counterfeit. Like, that just kind of goes without saying. So this example is mostly for platinum, but I want you to keep your mind open for the potentiality of it, at least. Just at least the potential of it. So mine turning gold into platinum is insane value, because one, it reads mine +2 money, basically, because it makes the jump from 3 to 5, which is in itself really good. So you're getting more value out of mine, but also it's allowing you to just buy a gold and then turn it into a platinum, which platinum costs 9, which is an insanely high price, and then gold just costs 6. Like, that's pretty good value. And platinum is a much better card than gold, so buying silvers to turn into golds is like way less value than buying golds to turn into platinum. Like, the jump is just way higher. So whenever platinum's on the board and I see mine, I'm always happy. I might not pick up a mine anyway, but like, it's something to keep tucked in the back of your mind. Definitely, it comes up decently often. Mine can also turn cards into Fool's Gold. Fool's Gold's a nice example of mine being useful. Turning coppers into Fool's Gold is a pretty nice trade, I would say. So stuff like that. Otherwise, mine has niche uses. It's not a good card. I would even say it's a bad card, but it does have its niche uses, and that's when it's useful, and that's when it can be absolutely pivotal. Is when you know a game's gonna take a long time and there's no real trashing. Then mine just slowly improves your deck. Also, there's the question of whether to trash a copper into a silver or a silver into a gold. And generally, you want to turn your coppers into silvers over turning your silvers into golds. Generally, you want to do this. But it's not a hard set rule, and you might have reasons for doing one or the other. So I can't really help you there. I'm not a statistician. But generally, I found turning coppers into silvers, if presented with the option, is better than turning silvers into golds, typically. Next, we have Moat. Moat, there's not really much to say about Moat, except that people forget it's a draw card and they forget that it exists, which is really funny. Like, Festival Mode is still worth going for. It's just really slow and super inconsistent. So moat doesn't draw you that much, but it does draw, so sometimes you just have to get it. And it can sometimes protect you against attacks. So if save's on the board and there's mountebank, you can save a moat every single turn and never get mountebanked, and then your opponent just spend a 5 on a terrible card. That's basically a $5 silver. So there's always that synergy to keep in mind with moat. I got burned by it twice, actually, which is really hilarious. And in the same match, it happened once, and then it happened again. And the second time, I felt like more of an idiot because I didn't see the save moat interaction. But there's stuff like that, and then there's like advanced stuff, and yeah, but like generally, moat's just a draw card. Just don't forget it draws cards. Is basically the gist of it. Moneylender, it costs 4. You may trash a copper from your hand for $3. Moneylender is a very good opener. It's very good at hitting 5 if you pair it with a silver, as an example. So you trash your copper, you have a silver, and then you just hit 5. Congrats. Moneylender, having 3 copper and a moneylender in hand, also hits 5. The sad hands are when there's moneylender with 2 copper and 2 estates. Those are the sad hands. Then you only hit 4. But then you have silver in your other hand, potentially combined with more coppers. So you're very likely to just hit 5. So moneylender is a very good card if you want to hit 5. It also thins a copper, which is pretty good. It loses its value pretty quickly once you run out of coppers, or like you start not finding coppers with your moneylender. Like that can happen, and then it's also terminal, and so moneylender does depreciate in value, but in the beginning of the game it's quite invaluable at hitting 5, and you can't really understate that. I think moneylender can sometimes get like frowned on for some reason. I think it's a very good card still, and it's 4. 4 is a nice price point for stuff like upgrade, and like 4 can turn into a 5, so when you're done with your moneylender you can toss it aside for a develop play or an upgrade play, or just trash for benefit in general. It's quite nice. So it synergizes quite well with like, you can use it up and then toss it away like a tissue. It's quite nice. I like moneylender. It's a pretty cool card. Yeah, there's not much else to say about it. It can slowly trash away your economy, so don't be stupid and don't not buy economy. Eventually you are going to need money, and moneylender can slowly kill your economy if you're never buying economy, so be careful. That can happen, so track your deck. Poacher is an interesting card. It's a pretty good opener. I wouldn't say a great opener, but it's a pretty good opener. So +1 card, +1 action, and +1 coin. I think like the odds of like if you open Poacher, silver is like slightly worse at hitting 5 than silver, but then you don't add a silver to your deck, so who cares? Like that's a perfectly fine trade. It's very slight, I think, if I remember correctly. Anyway, Poacher draws you a card, and then you discard a card per empty supply pile. So if one pile is empty, it turns into Oasis for $4, which is sad. And then if there are 2 piles empty, then Poacher just gets significantly worse. You toss 2 cards. And heaven forbid you play like 6-player or something. Then you're tossing 3 cards if there are 3 piles gone. Like that's super, like I'm assuming you're not playing 6-player when you're playing Poacher. Like don't play 6-player. But yeah, Poacher is it's a card. There's really not much to say about it. Like if you know there's a card that's going to deplete from the pile pretty quickly, you might not get too many Poachers. But taking 1 or 2 at the start or buying it over a silver is pretty good, I would say. There's some people I think who say Poacher is better than Merchant, and I think I agree with that. But Merchant starts getting a lot better than Poacher after the early game. But yeah, they're nice cards. Next we have Remodel. Remodel is a card that is a little hard to evaluate. but it's a perfectly fine opener, and you might open it quite a lot of the time just to kill an estate. I would postulate that if you're going to open remodel, you really need to invest in draw in order to make it higher odds that your remodel will find your second and third estates, because if it doesn't, remodel it's sad, because you don't really want to trash a copper with remodel. It's just not very good. There's some good 2 costs, but just as often there aren't any good 2 costs, and you'll end up remodeling a copper into an estate. Like, that's terrible. That's really bad. So if you get a remodel, you want to keep your eye on drawing or making it more likely that you set up your remodel with your second and third estate. So that's your idea when opening remodel. Remodel also threatens province pileouts. It can put pressure on your opponent to kind of keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. Like, you're on the clock, hurry up. So you can province a bunch, and then on your last turn, instead of hitting 8, all you have to do is find your gold in your remodel and then empty the provinces. So it's like another win condition in a sense. It just gives you higher odds of winning versus not winning. So remodel can do that for you. It can mill provinces. So if your opponent's taking longer, but he's like, all right, cool, I'll let you have 4 provinces, but I can, in the next couple of turns, get 4 provinces and a duchy, and then I win. I can win the long game. Well, remodel makes it harder for that player to win the long game. It can rush things down a little bit. And then remodel does things for you in the meantime, such as killing a state into a silver, which is insane value. It does 2 things at once. It removes a bad card, and it gives you a card that's better. Albeit silver isn't that great, but maybe you kill an estate into a ironmonger, or a throne room, or a village. Like, well, cool, you just gained a card and removed a bad card in one play. Like, that's pretty good value for remodel. I think it's just important to remember when remodel isn't so good. Like Shelter's games, remodel immediately gets a lot worse. I wouldn't say a lot worse, because a lot of the time you're just remodeling an estate into a silver anyway, so. But you can do better than that with estates. You can remodel them into 4 costs, which is usually better. So remodel gets worse. Typically, even if you don't open remodel, which is actually quite often, I just don't want to underplay the remodel open, because it's certainly a thing you can do. But if you're not opening remodel, there's a good chance you'll want to remodel at some point, no matter what, because you do want to have the flexibility of just ending the game or threatening to. It's a good card. Like, and later you can turn your silvers into 5 costs. Like, it's just a very flexible card that lets you threaten things, and it's pretty easy to sleep on, I think. So it's quite valuable. Sentry is a card that I absolutely hate, because it is one of the swingiest fucking cards in the entire game, and it's good. It's really good too, especially if you can open it. So it gives you +1 card, +1 action. Look at the top 2 cards of your deck, trash and or discard any number of them, and then put the rest back on top in any order. So you play your Sentry, you buy your Sentry turn 1, and then you play Sentry and you just trash a bunch of cards. Well, that was nice. But at the same time, Sentry can decide, yeah, I'm going to never find estates. In fact, the estates are going to follow me every time you draw me. And then Sentry gets really sad and you want another trasher. Typically, I find that Sentry is best as a helper rather than the main trasher. You might want like a remodel or something else to help you finish up the job. Sentry's also good at cycling and setting up turns and helping you find cards, which is quite good. But if your opponent gets bullshit luck with Sentry and just trashes all the estates immediately and trashes 2 cards every single time, whereas the first time you play Sentry, you find like 1 card to trash, or bless you. Bless me, I mean. Where you only find 1 card, or heaven forbid, no cards to trash, the game just quickly spirals into just a verbiage of just obscenities as you're just swearing at your deck as if to why it's not working. And that happens actually frequently, often. So, Sentry is a card that's pretty bullshit. Because of that, you can play it right and then just get absolutely burned for it, more so than most cards, I would say. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Sentry is an amazing trasher. Some people have gone as far as to say it's better than Chapel, which I think is absolutely wrong. That's super insane to say. Like, that's not true. But it is quite good. It's definitely up there. Yeah, like, if you can buy a Sentry and there's no, like, it's a good trasher. It's a pretty good trasher, I would say. It's a very good trasher. I don't want to undersell it. It's very good. Throne Room, it's a card you don't want early, but it's definitely a card you want late. It can be a village. You can play a Throne Room on a Throne Room to play on a Sentry, and then you have flexibility to play it on even a cantrip, and then, hey, you just drew a bunch of cards. Throne Room is a fantastic card, but it's a card you want a bit later versus sooner, because if you have let's say you have a hand of Sentry Throne Room, Smithy Throne Room versus Village Smithy, you would just prefer to have Village and Smithy over Throne Room and Smithy, or Village and Throne Room. You would have just preferred to have a Smithy instead of a Throne Room. So there is a threat of buying Throne Rooms too early, or buying too many of them at once. But typically Throne Room is very good. You play a Throne Room on, say, a Smithy at the start of your turn after playing a Village. Well, you just played a bunch of draw cards, and now you have more cards to decide what to do next optimally. That's insane. You just drew 6 cards. That's very good. Off of one action, basically. That's immensely valuable. So Throne Room is a Village variant in that sense too, where it lets you play a card twice instead of once for the cost of one action. It's also very good at value. Like, you play a Throne Room on a Laboratory. Well, not only did you just spend a 4 cost to play a 5 cost, making it a 5 cost basically, but you also got an action out of it, which is very good. So, Throne Room is a better than the sum of its parts card, but you need parts for it to work. And the less parts you have, the worse Throne Room gets. So you typically want to get Throne Rooms later. You might get an early Throne Room, but it's kind of a case-by-case basis, and you kind of have to have a good eye and a good sense of when to add it. But the value Throne Room provides for you, if the stars line up, is just astronomical for the price. Like, the value you get is just very good. Next card is Vassal. Vassal is, I think it's a good card. That, like, people, Vassal's kind of like a is kind of a litmus test on how people are to risk aversion. Like, people who don't like the risk, like, say Mick Seanock. He hates the card, he never gets it. And then there are people like Dan Brooks who just pick up tons of Vassals and they play with them all the time. And both seem similarly winning to me. Like, Vassal is better, but then you have your dud turns, so like it's a higher risk play to get Vassals potentially. If you can set up your Vassals with cards such as Sentry or Cartographer, Vassal gets amazing, gets very good. You could play a Vassal to play a Vassal to play a Vassal to play a Vassal to play a cantrip, and then your turn just continues. If you draw your deck too soon, Vassal gets absolutely shit, because you just played a Terminal Silver that does nothing. However, this can be mitigated with gain and play. Like, for example, you Ironworks gain a village, then you just Vassal the village you just gained. It can do that too. So, like, the story doesn't end if you draw your deck. It's just, you have to be careful. You have to be careful. But by and large, I would say don't be too afraid to open Vassal and an action card. Yes, they can collide. Yes, it can be sad, but if you play your vassal and you find your action card, you're super happy. If your action card you pair with vassal is, say, a non-terminal, then you're also happy because it's like, okay, cool. You don't care about collision. You have a card. You have a silver that cycles you a card. Like, what are you gonna cycle? That's so sad. You can't cycle the action card. You'll just play it. Oh, you cycle a copper? Okay, maybe that screws up a turn, but that would have to be like a turn 3 vassal play, in which case, yeah, maybe it'll screw up your turn. Maybe it'll cause you to hit 4 instead of 5, but, like, that's not too risk averse. Like, that's not terrible. And the trade-off you get, which is getting your shuffle in 1 card sooner, seeing 1 extra new card is pretty good. So, like, it's okay to have 1 or 2 vassals in your deck, pretty much, most games. It's not going to kill you. Of course, you have to balance that with how many terminals you realistically want in your deck. If you can set up your vassals, like, it's a pretty deck understanding heavy card, and it's okay to. I would recommend definitely playing around with this on the client, just kind of messing around with it a bit and getting a feel for it, I think. That's kind of how I approach Vassal. I tend to be more on the Dan Brooks side of things. I think it's okay to wing it with Vassal a lot of the time. You can just get more than 1. Just be ballsy. Why not? Like, it's just a game. Like, might as well have a little fun. We talked about Village. Witch is one of the strongest cards in Dominion. It costs 5, draws you 2 cards, and each other player gains a curse. So the draw is not insignificant, of course, but the main deal is that it gains opponents a curse. And it cycles you closer to finding the next witch, which will also give your opponent another curse. It's a card you absolutely cannot ignore on most boards, and if you're not getting a witch immediately, it only means it's because you're getting a witch later. It's what I tend to find. Because the thing about witch is, oh, there's chapel on the board, who cares? Oh, you're playing witch? Okay, I'll just chapel the curse away. Alright, well, okay, then you just don't get witch immediately. You just get witch when your opponent starts provincing. So now it's harder for them to get rid of the curse, and it's harder for them to draw their deck, and adding curses to their deck makes it even harder for, like, witch is insane. And if you ignore a witch, okay, cool. Are you prepared to take all 10 curses? Can you end the game before taking all 10 curses and win? Most boards, this is not the case. So you want to get witch. Because the punishment for not getting witch is taking all those curses up your ass, which you don't want. I would rather not get fucked by a curse. Thank you. I'm good. I'm going to pass on that. But, yeah. And, of course, if you commit to witch and your opponent commits to witch and you win the split 4-6, well, that's a 2-point differential, and your opponent has an extra junk card in their deck, too. Actually, 2 extra junk cards, because you only have 4, they have 6. So 2 extra junk cards, and then minus 2 VP, so they're behind. Of course, the story's not over. You can have some bullshit shuffles, or they can have some god mode shuffles where they draw all their curses in the bottom of their deck, and then they trigger the shuffle, essentially having a shuffle with very few curses. It happens. But typically, you're going to win those games more than not if you win the curse split. But the story isn't over, of course. And of course, I already mentioned the fact that if you don't get witch now, you'll get it later when your opponent starts greening, and that's a thing to keep an eye open on. Like, most people, they decide, oh, witch isn't good, so it must not be good forever. Well, you just delay your witch game, you just get it a bit later. And you also have to realize, witch, even if your opponent can trash the card, it can potentially be very inconvenient for him to do so. He might have to spend actions he'd otherwise would play on other things in order to kill the curse that you just gave him. And you're drawing cards with this witch. The witch isn't just giving him a curse, it's drawing you 2 cards. You are getting value out of the witch. So you can definitely do it as a just to slow your opponent down, even if he's killing the curses as you're giving it to him. You just want to be careful, of course. And there are cases where you're playing Witch, and that just means you got it too early, right? Because then your opponent just kills the curse. Oh, I don't care, and then you're good. So you have to keep an eye on that. But yeah, Witch is one of the best cards in Dominion. It's stood the test of time. It's insanely powerful. Workshop is the last card in the base set that we're going to be discussing today, because it's the only card in the base set left to talk about. You gain a card costing up to 4, and it costs 3. Workshop, I think, gets slept on a bit. There are a lot of cards costing up to 4 that are quite good to get. Up to and including silver. I did mention earlier that bureaucrat is a shitty workshop variant for gaining silvers if you really want them when you're drawing your deck, and workshop can perform that function that I just mentioned with bureaucrat like probably an hour ago at this point. In addition, workshop can gain you engine pieces, it can gain you stuff for trash for benefit. It's a flexible card. Now, it's not a very good card, but if you draw your deck and you have a workshop and you have the actions to spare, workshop can help you with gain and play, it can help you get economy. It's a flexible card. Now, you might not open it, but you might pick one up a little bit later. It's pretty kingdom dependent, but generally the earlier you pick up a workshop, the more value you get out of it too. Now, mind you, it does not help you hit 5 on the first shuffle. That's the main issue with opening workshop. If you open workshop silver, you're saying, okay, I'm alright with potentially not getting a 5 because I want the maximum value of gainage out of my workshop to gain all the villages. That's what you're saying when you open workshop over, say, double silver. And I say that's not worth it. Usually if the 5 is that good, I just want to open double silver or silver plus some action, and then I pick up my workshop on the next shuffle, and then I start draining the villages. But maybe the 5 isn't that important, in which case you're happy to open workshop silver. Yeah, if I land the 5, I land the 5. I land the cobbler, cool. And then if I don't, I'm not going to sweat it. I'm just going to pile drive these ironmongers or something. So, like, workshop ironmonger is a very nice open, because ironmonger's a card you want all of them, potentially. So, it's a case-by-case basis with workshop. It really depends on the kingdom, and workshop is probably worse than remodel. I would say it's definitely worse than remodel. It can do more than remodel early on, if remodel doesn't find its states quickly enough. But then after remodel just kind of scales in power, and workshop just kind of stays slightly better than when remodel first comes in. Like, it's a worse card than remodel for sure. But I don't think it's bad. It's certainly better than bureaucrat. Like, bureaucrat's awful. Anyway, these were all the base cards, kind of how I approach them, what I think about them. Kind of a detailed analysis on all of the cards. If you have any questions or comments or whatever, feel free to leave them. I'll answer them to the best of my ability. And next time we will be talking about Intrigue. Hopefully I won't be sick then. Thanks everyone for watching, and have a nice day. Please stop recording.